Hi there, everyone, and welcome to the Novel Strip Show, the show where I give my opinion about books and comics that I've read. Today, what I'd like to do is flip back to April and May last year, 2017, and give my opinion about books that I read in those 2 months. Normally I just do 1 month at a time. However, in April 2017 I was moving house, so I only read, I think it was one book that month. So I've just combined together the books that I read in April and May to have a bit more content to the video. So I'll just crack straight on, and again I'm continuing with the format of trying to give a novel fact about each of the books that I read to live up to the name of the channel a bit more. If these are actually boring and just to make the video longer and you don't find them interesting, please let me know, and that will save me some time doing them. So I'll crack off then, starting with the book that I enjoyed least. There weren't actually many that I enjoyed. In fact, 3 of the books got 5 stars and made it to my favourite shelf as well on Goodreads, so I'm very, very excited about this series here. So let's crack on then. So the first thing that I actually read, and the thing that I enjoyed the least rather, was the Divergent series by Veronica Roth. So for a quick summary of the series, it's set in a dystopian society in the future that's been split into factions based upon different human qualities or virtues. So for example, there's the Dauntless faction, which are known to be fearless. There's the Erudite faction, which is known for intelligence, etc. So when a member of each of the factions reaches a certain age in the books, it's 16. In the films, I believe it's 18. I've only seen the first film. They have to take a test which tells them which faction would suit them most, and then there's a ceremony where they can choose to change faction, or they can remain in the faction that they were assigned at birth. And basically in the series we follow the protagonist Triss. She starts off in the selfless faction called Abnegation, and she has some unusual results in her test, and then eventually she chooses to go into the Dauntless faction, and we follow her journey through 3 books. So the novel fact for this is that the author, Veronica Roth, was just 22 when she wrote the book, and there's some exploration of the character's fears in the book, which she based on her own fears, in particular her fear of heights and her fear of swarming animals. Onto my opinion then. So initially I rated the first 2 books 4 stars and then the last book 3 stars on Goodreads. Thinking back and looking at the series as a whole, I think, to be honest, I would actually put that right down to 2.5 stars. So as I've kind of read more, or as I read more through last year, and I read a lot more now, I like young adult fantasy less and less. And I think comparing it to other young adult fantasy series such as Hunger Games, I definitely preferred this a lot less. It wasn't quite as bad as the 100 series, but it was probably, pretty close to that when I think about it. Especially the last book, it was that kind of dragged the whole thing down for me. So yeah, I just didn't really find the concept as interesting as the Hunger Games. I didn't think it was as kind of unique. I didn't like the character development. I found Triss pretty annoying, to be honest. I really didn't like the romance between her and Thor. In the last book especially, the format changes. So whilst the previous 2 books are narrated by Triss, the final book switches between her perspective and Thor's perspective. Thor is the one who becomes her love interest. And I really, really didn't like that. I think if you're going to have switching perspectives, you need to have that from the very start of the series. If that had been the case from the start of the series, I may well have even liked it more. However, because it was a change just for the last book, it seems like it was kind of thrown in as an experiment, as it was an afterthought. It made me feel like the series wasn't planned very well from the beginning, and I didn't like it. I just found it very, very jarring. So yeah, definitely didn't like the last book. Another reason for that is because it includes a lot. It starts to include much more of a sci-fi element, and there's more kind of science and genetics involved, and I just don't think that was done very well. So yeah, again, it fell into the kind of area of YA a lot that I don't really enjoy, and I almost certainly wouldn't go back and read it again. I get why it is enjoyable, and obviously if I initially at the time rated it 4 stars for the first 2 books, I do remember reading them very quickly and wanting to read on and being able to read them very quickly. So I do think, it's not absolutely awful, but I don't think I would really recommend it, and I don't see myself ever going back to reading it again. I did prefer the first book to the first film, but I don't think the film was as bad as many people say it was. So I'd still, say if you do like it, it's worth giving both the film and the book a try. Okay, so let's move on to the next book then. So this was Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. So for a quick summary of the novel, it's about a girl who watches a couple every day from the window on the train, and she imagines them having the perfect life. She creates kind of little stories about them in her head, and then one day she sees something that makes her realise their relationship might not be so perfect after all. She goes to the police and tries to tell them what she saw, but they're quite unhelpful. They don't really believe her because she's an unreliable person and an unreliable narrator, as we'll find out. So she basically starts to look into things herself. That's the basic plot of the story. In terms of the novel facts, this was actually quite interesting for me to find out. It was basically the author's story is kind of rags to riches, so a bit like J.K. Rowling or something like that. The author was completely broke when she wrote the first book, and she had to borrow money from her father to survive. But her agent was quite impressed with the first part of the manuscript, with just the first half of the book. So her agent encouraged her to send it off to publishers unfinished, and then they picked it up, they published it, and in 2015, when it came out, it became the fastest selling adult hardback in novel history. So it's gone on to achieve great things, which is great. In terms of my opinion, I definitely wouldn't say it's one of the greatest books ever, but I definitely enjoyed it. So I originally rated it 4 stars. I would probably knock that down to maybe 3 or 3.5. It was definitely a good thriller. It was really quick to read. The pacing was very good, and I definitely wanted to read on. But I did find the protagonist incredibly annoying. I didn't really like the voice that she was given, and especially the last 50 pages, I just found them completely predictable. I could have told you exactly what was going to happen, and that's exactly what did happen. And since then, I've read other books, 2 in particular, that are Gone Girl, a lot of people compare it to, and I would say, in terms of it being a thriller, I would compare it to I Am Pilgrim. I preferred those two much, much more. I think they were better done. And for that reason, I'd probably drop it down to 3 or 3.5. But still, definitely worth picking up if you want quite a quick read and just kind of thriller, and especially if you enjoy things with unreliable narrators. So next up then was 1984 by George Orwell. So for a quick summary, it's set in the dystopian future, or past now, I guess, but it was Orwell, when he was writing it, he was imagining the future. He was imagining the year of 1984, which was 40 years after the end of the Second World War, and but we basically follow the protagonist Winston Smith, who's a middle-aged man living under the influence of the totalitarian superstate called Oceania, and he's under constant surveillance of Big Brother and the Thought Police. For a novel fact, there's I just found this interesting because I quite like language. Supposedly there exists an Italian translation in which the first line says the clock strikes uno instead of 13. The first line is, it was a bright cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. And supposedly the Italian translator wrote that the clocks struck 1, and then wrote a note or said to the publisher, Italian clocks don't strike 13. Italian clocks don't go up to 13. They stop at 12, which obviously is the whole point. I just thought that was quite amusing. Apparently Anthony Burgess, another author, spurred on this rumour, but I don't know how true it is. I just thought it was interesting and funny though, because the translator had obviously missed the point. In terms of my opinion of the book, then I really, really enjoyed it. In general, I've enjoyed everything that I've read by George Orwell, and I like how when I was, researching for interesting facts, another one that I found out was that George Orwell actually had TB whilst he was writing the book. And I thought that was really interesting because Winston has a lot of he coughing fits and things like that. So I thought it was really interesting how all these little tidbits of Orwell's life were kind of slotted in to the novel. And I found the world really, really easy to envisage. And after it, I was kind of quite paranoid actually, because it affected me that much, and I was so able to imagine the world. One of the concepts in it is Newspeak, which is where the thought police or Big Brother, they basically use language to manipulate people, and I think we can definitely see that in our world today. And it's pretty terrifying, to be honest, because the whole thing, it was basically like an episode of Black Mirror. It was like we're just a hair away, it's just a hair away from reality, and this could quite easily happen. And indeed, in many cases, it feels like it's already happening. So yeah, I absolutely I loved it because of that. Because of how it affected me and how it gripped me, and the concepts. However, it did definitely drag in some places, and I liked Orwell's writing style in this far less than I liked Animal Farm. So yeah, it was a bit of a drag at points, but yeah, I rated it 4 stars at the time, and I'd say definitely 4 stars now, if not 4.5. I think my love for it is only kind of grown, and when I think back to it, I definitely have very fond memories of it. So yeah, definitely one I'd recommend. Next up then is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. So from here, the next three that I'm going to talk about, that they're not really in order. I can't really compare them. I like them all equally. Gave them all 5 stars, and they're definitely some of my favourites. In terms of Bell Jar, then, for a summary, we follow Esther Greenwood, who's a writer, and we follow her story as she succumbs to a breakdown and spirals into depression and insanity. For the novel fact, the reception to the novel was originally quite tepid, with Plath struggling to find a publisher in America. So that may have contributed to her successful suicide a month after the book was published. I say successful suicide because she had previously attempted to commit suicide numerous times, and obviously she drew upon that to write the book. In terms of what I thought about it, I absolutely loved it, and I think, as someone who suffered from depression, I think the way that it's dealt with, her declines dealt with, I recognised a lot of what Esther was going through, and I think it it helps you to understand what it's like going through depression if you never have. I think it's quite easy to follow Esther, and follow her mental state in its decline, and helps you to understand exactly what she's going through if it's something you've never experienced. If it is something that you have experienced and you recognize it as well, I think it can help to recognize that you may have an issue, and that is something that you can seek help for. So I think it's useful for that. In terms of how everything developed, I could imagine Esther really, really clearly. The novel does end on a very positive note as well, so I did like that. And yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think the character of Esther was someone I could quite clearly imagine and quite clearly get into her headspace. It can be incredibly depressing, so if you are in a particularly bad mood, I would say it's not necessarily going to help it, even though there is some kind of optimism at the end, and there is suicide is discussed, as well as self-harm. So if that's something you'd rather not read about, then don't. But overall, I think it's an incredibly important novel to read, and I absolutely loved it. Next up then is The Collector by John Fowles. So for the summary, we follow the protagonist, Frederick Clegg, who collects butterflies. He then wins some money and decides that now he's got all this money, he's going to use it to kidnap a girl who he's normally admired. Who he's previously admired from afar. He decides he's going to kidnap her and collect her, basically. For the novel fact, this, given its subject, has actually inspired several, well, said to be the inspiration for several killings, serial killings, kidnappings, and other criminal activities. So when people have been caught, they've claimed that the collector was their inspiration or justification for their crimes. In terms of my opinion, I definitely don't think the book should justify crime. Nothing should, really, especially not kidnapping or rape or killing. Nothing justifies that. But I definitely enjoyed this book. I think the two characters, so Miranda, the girl who's kidnapped, and Frederick, who kidnaps her, they're incredibly well developed. We get to see both their points of view. And I found myself able to get into their headspace incredibly easily. One instance is when they have a discussion about literature, so they talk about Catcher in the Rye, and they also talk about art as well, and I found their conversation incredibly intriguing. I absolutely loved it, and the way they discussed those subjects was fascinating. However, there's also parts where Frederick's kind of giving his rationale and justifying why he would kidnap Miranda, and you almost start to... You can see where he's coming from, which I think is pretty incredible, because if someone said in real life that they had all this money, they had all this spare time, what else would they do but, kidnap someone who they'd always admired? You would probably or hopefully think they were pretty insane. But the way he rationalizes it and getting into his kind of head, into his kind of thoughts and the way that he thinks, it almost starts to make a vague sort of sense. So that was quite uncomfortable. That was quite chilling for me. But nevertheless, I very much enjoyed the experience. And yeah, the ending as well is quite haunting, quite harrowing. So yeah, I loved it overall. I thought it was an incredible book. But yeah, definitely shouldn't be an inspiration to go on a killing spree or kidnap anyone. It is just fiction. Lastly then was Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. So for the summary of the story, it follows the journey of Pip, who's a poor young orphan who travels to London to become a gentleman, to become sort of upper class, after receiving funds from a mysterious benefactor to allow him to do so. For a novel fact, it's said to be one of Dickens' darkest novels in tone. However, he originally intended it to be a comedy. He wrote in a letter to one of his friends that it was going to be a comic serialization. However, the reason for it taking a darker turn may have been because Dickens wrote it during one of the lowest points in his life. So at the time of writing it, he'd separated from his wife for 22 years. His son had run up lots of gambling debts. His daughter had married a man who he didn't like. His mother was beginning to show signs of dementia, and he was making advances towards a young actress who he was pursuing, and they were being spurned initially, at least. So yeah, he had all this in mind when he was writing it. Onto my opinion, because of all that going on in his mind, it is definitely quite a dark novel, quite gravelly in tone, but I absolutely loved that. For ages, if anyone asked me, even now probably, I would say this is my favourite book of all time. The characters do seem, incredibly odd. They're quite outlandish, like Miss Havisham, for example. I can't really imagine anyone becoming Miss Havisham and existing in real life, yet she's so well developed, and I can see and imagine her so clearly that I completely believe she would exist. So yeah, I definitely think that the kind of humanity of the novel, whilst I imagine it definitely set in the past, and it is a historical novel set in the past, it is quite aged, and you definitely get a sense of kind of old worldness. The time that Pip grows up in is very important. It's a big part of the novel. However, yeah, the human side of it, it's I think it kind of just transcends sort of temporal bonds, because yeah, the kind of hard time and the suffering is there, but there's the other side to it as well. The just the relationships that everyone has. So Pip's kind of stepdad, I suppose, is actually his sister's boyfriend. Joe, he's a kind of good-hearted, good-natured blacksmith. So he's quite dim. He's not very bright at all. But I generally think like you get such a sense of his good heart, his good nature through the whole novel. That I think he's a brilliant example. He's the example of what it means to be a kind, good-hearted person. The best example that I've read of all literature, to be honest. And there was, yeah, one point where I thought something bad might have happened to him, and I genuinely felt the urge to cry because he's just, yeah, such an amazing character. So good-hearted, and quite dim as well. But you never feel like he's dumb. It makes him even more endearing. And his and Pip's relationship is yeah, pretty incredible as well. His sister who looks after him, she's a complete bitch, and I kind of like that as well. Just kind of seeing how cruel she is, isn't nice, obviously, but it does kind of add drama to the novel, and I can definitely imagine people like her. I think also as well, the kind of want to ascend social class. That's something that even today is around, especially in Britain. And yeah, so I think it's really interesting seeing how things like that have changed since Dickens' day, and how they've stayed the same as well. And yeah, there's just the humanity and the relationships that happen within the novel. I think are pretty incredible. I have to admit, it did take me a really long time to read. Basically because it's also as well as being a great story, as well as allowing me to imagine the characters and everything. The writing is quite old fashioned, but also very beautiful. So I took my time over every sentence, over every word, because it was beautifully written, and I didn't want to miss anything. I wanted to experience it as fully as I could, but that meant experiencing it quite slowly. So I think that may have put me off slightly reading any more of Dickens' work so far. But also I'm kind of saving them because I'm quite sure that I'll love them. So yeah, definitely a book that I'd recommend to everyone. And I would say it's definitely worth working your way through it and taking your time over it if you are struggling with it initially. So yeah, that was everything that I read in April and May 2017. Thanks very much for watching, and as always, please let me know if you've read any of those books, what you thought.